Thank you for that nice introduction, and thank you for having me. So today I'm going to talk about a cluster of ideas I've been working on over the past year: developer tools, learning, and care. So I'd like to start. I'll tell you a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. I'll tell you who I am and why I'm talking to you about this. I'll talk more about this idea of care and challenges for advocacy in the developer experience. It's so nice to be in this group where the notion of advocacy is very widespread. And then I'll talk a little bit about the work that I've done with teams and some anti-patterns, or I've seen the past two presentations have had some best practices, but I feel like I've witnessed some not so best practices. Lastly, I'll share some design principles that we developed on a recent project. So who am I and why am I talking to you about this? I am a design researcher, and over the past few years, I've worked a lot with developer-facing tools and worked with teams building developer tools. And I've been in and around the tech industry for about 10 years, but I started out as a human-computer interaction researcher. And lastly, I've also been the primary caregiver to my daughter for the past 5 years. And this experience has been so enlightening to me and also changed the way I've seen the way that we do work in so many ways. But it's been very hard for me to reconcile this with the way that we tend to work in the everyday. So I'm going to make a confession. I hate the term user. It's such Brenda Laurel calls it a demeaning little word. And yesterday I was chatting with the brilliant Sarah Sharp, and we were talking about the term contributor. Like, instead of we make this thing that somebody else is just going to use, like, how are the folks who are interacting with your product or interacting with your framework down the line, how are they contributing to what you've already built? But coming, the field, it's often, people say, well, what do you actually do, Amelia? And the work that I do in terms of understanding how people use products, understanding common errors, spending time doing ethnographic interviewing, this all comes from human-computer interaction, which has a long background. We have evidence of ergonomic alterations from ancient Greece, from the 5th century BCE. So folks have been trying to optimize tools in order to work better and to work more productively for millennia. But the roots of contemporary HCI are in the post-war era. And I like to say that I work from the assumption that we are all about Homer Simpson capable. So a lot of the literature that we draw on does come from this era of pilots and nuclear power operators working on analog computers. And, this is we are very blind to material culture, especially when we're working on code-centric products. But these things are super useful to think about. So where is this relationship between experience and advocacy and care? I'm going to do a brief summation of what I've been working on and where I see these things connecting. I come from I've drawn on heavily in my own work the field of feminist ethics and the notion that all work, all contributions are equally important. And we often work from a standpoint like what we are doing is the most important. But what enables us to go to work to be productive? It's often a whole chain of folks who are making life possible for us. And secondly, what is this idea? What do we owe our users? How can we care for the users of our products? This is something that I think that the tech industry has to reckon with. Can we see a security breach as a lapse of care? Can we see bad documentation or lack of documentation as a lapse in care? Especially since what the word developer means now is way different than what it meant 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and we have an increasing global diversity in our ranks. It's not enough now to assume that just because this works for me, I built this for me, it'll work for everyone else. And so how do we provide that? And over the past year, I've been looking into how different frames of thought frame care. And if you look up just the term care in various academic journals, you'll find analyses of care in nursing and bioethics and medicine. But you'll also find it in all sorts of applied disciplines. And I really like this definition from sociologists that say caring takes on 3 forms. Instrumental, which is the washing, feeding, getting you places, the sort of thing that you do for a small child or a very old person. But then there are 2 other dimensions, which I think are very prominent in developer advocacy work: emotional and informational. Emotional care includes listening, troubleshooting, walking folks through things. Informational care is applying best practices in a way that makes sense to the person who encounters them. So developing a tutorial is a form of informational care. Developing documentation is a form of informational care. And I think it's important to understand on a global economic level just how important care is. In the industry, we think of ourselves as economic drivers, but the truth is that 81% of US jobs are in the service sector, and this number is expected to go up. Professional caregiver is going to be the largest occupation in the US by the year 2020. And this accounts for 67% of US economic output. Moreover, care has a global supply chain. We have a president who's a hotel man, and who works in hotels? Immigrants. Who works taking care of children? Often immigrants. Economists and sociologists have done in-depth work on migratory patterns that revolve around care. But in our current way of thinking, we often think of things in terms of the more we can do to obscure care, the smoother it'll seem for the end user. And this is from Adaptive Path, which is a San Francisco-based design agency. And they say, oh, let's obscure the processes and systems, make it seem like magic, which this is a little infantilizing. I don't want to, I'm a systems person. I want to see how things work. I don't want to be told that it's magic. And I also think that this is where things hit the fan when we are building back-end products, is that we know this isn't magic. We know that things are messy. We know that the development process is fraught with errors and bugs and misunderstandings and things that don't work. And yet we still say, oh, we're going to build things where that messiness is concealed. And we also like to prioritize the work that we do over any other sort of work. If you've ever worked on a team that did lockdown or death marches, you can't even walk your dog if you're working 24 hours a day. And this limits who we are, who is creating technology and who we're creating it for. There's also the question, and this has come up a bit, I'm not trying to slag on Facebook, I promise, but, this has come up a lot in the recent weeks and months about content moderation. There's over 100,000 folks in the Philippines working in this industry of content moderation. And this is something we've offshored, we've obscured, and we don't really talk about when, when we talk about building community and moderating content, we often frame it in terms of AI and in terms of machine learning. But it is human effort, and often very hard human effort on the other end of this. And then there's the question of who is doing the care work. And if we're going to talk about the problem of diversity in the tech industry, maybe we should be talking about the problem of care. Because it's Black and brown women doing the care work in the tech industry, even though we're often very underrepresented. And this, to me, on a personal level, is a quandary. I grew up in a Spanish-speaking household, and if I hear someone speaking Spanish in a client office or on a tech campus, it's usually the cleaning staff or the kitchen staff. And what does it mean when you walk into a professional situation and you're statistically a lot more like the support staff? And is there a way that we can engage with care that helps us think through this better? And so over the past year, I've been doing a lot of soul searching and a lot of thinking about, how can we affect this change? And I reached the conclusion that by continuing to do my work, not, quitting to run a recreational marijuana farm, which is, legal in Oregon, by working to improve developer experiences and to bring care to developer experiences, this is a way to affect cultural change. And what kinds of cultural shifts have to happen in order for us to design for care? How do we change our mindset in order to, go from, as Jen Schiffer said so hilariously, I've never written a bug, to understanding vulnerability, to understanding making mistakes, to understanding that what we build is for ourselves and for people like us often requires a different set of accommodations for other folks. And so I'll share some anti-patterns that I've seen in my own work. Over the past few years, I've worked with teams at Nike and Intel, Mozilla, as well as smaller startups and open source projects on building tools that helped onboard newer and different developers. And we did this work by doing ethnographic interviews. I've probably interviewed about 50 developers over the past 2 years in terms of usability, as well as worked with teams of many dozen more. My goal in this is always to understand workflows, to understand mental models, and to understand what's missing that could improve the developer experience across organizations and across teams. And I've noticed a few things that keep coming up in different organizations and in different ways. And I'll talk about these a little bit more in detail. The first is the idea of rolling your own solutions and then assuming that everyone else will grok them. The second is a culture that does not dedicate resources for documentation. And I have a feeling that a lot of the folks in this room do not come from cultures like that. But it means that, when there are fewer resources for documentation, it means that documentation is everybody's job and no one's job. And thus, it doesn't happen. Third is this culture that discourages stupid questions. As a design researcher, I love to ask stupid questions. Oh, what is an SDK? And not because I'm ignorant, but because I want to hear how you define it. I wanted to hear how these parts fit together in other people's minds, because there's a lot that we can learn from asking stupid questions. And the last factor that I've noticed is a very uneven answer to the question, who is this for? A lack of strategy and planning in terms of who we think is going to use this product and in what way. So first, the roll your own. This hits a lot of bumps right away. Like, what about users who are different from you and your team? And, one of the clearest examples of this is keyboard shortcuts. If you're an Emacs user, you have a different set of keyboard shortcuts than a Vim user. And this is something that comes up not only in developer tools, but also in accessibility. And the tool that I put together, the tool that I've made to sort of counteract this is a coloring sheet. And I made some copies that you all can come and get from me. How I guarantee you'll see things differently if you sit down and with some colored pencils and color in the keyboard shortcuts that you're assuming folks are going to take. And this is something that, when I interview developers, they say, I just want to see like some best practices and a story. I want to see the story of why I would use this. The second aspect, and this is something that I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but, this lack of resources and urgency around support, community, and documentation. Working with a hardware company recently, I was interviewing developers about how they use the internal APIs. And they would say, I heard this over and over again, well, I know the documentation is not great, so I'm just going to go find the guy who made it. And it's like, this does not scale at all. How do we, if we rely on relationships, this will not scale outside of your building. And there's also just a lack of scaffolding around documentation. So if somebody does write documentation for a tool that they've built, oftentimes it's not organized, or organized in a standard way. And even simple navigation elements, plain old HTML, are often very useful in this regard. The next, and this little blurb is from the blog Coding Horror. It's this question of, if I ask for help, or I ask for clarification, or even if I ask for more documentation, I admit vulnerability, and I risk, looking foolish. And this is something that I don't have the answer to, and I don't think any of us individually have the answer to, but how do we build a culture that allows folks to point out the holes that they see, allows us to point out weakness in terms of, I don't understand that. That doesn't make sense to me. Rather than, oh, that looks good. Yeah, I can totally do that. And the last I have noticed is this question of, who is this for? And over, I will see, I'll work with a team. They have a product that they're very excited to roll out. They think it's great. They've been using it internally, but when a new set of eyes, when we bring in a new set of eyes, they say, "Well, I don't really know what this is for, or how I would use it in my job." Or if it's if it's an API written by C developers, who then when you put it in front of JavaScript developers, they say, I don't, these calls don't make sense to me. I don't understand what these functions are. How can we both, deliver abstraction and automation, but also deliver a cohesive set of stories and documentation around it? So what I'd like to do is to urge us all, and this is something that for this crowd is probably not news, but to work rather from this vague notion of empathy that's become very, very common recently, because empathy without action is pretty meaningless. How can we work not only as advocates, but as allies, as accomplices? I love this zine that came out of Indigenous Action, Accomplices, Not Allies. But the idea that we forge connections not to act for other folks, but to act with them. And what can we do with brand new developers in other parts of the world? What can we do with folks who are completely different? How can we partner with them in order to build things that we would never build to begin with? I think there's a lot of potential here. And there's certainly a lot of opportunity to build new viewpoints based on this. And so lastly, how much time do I have? Okay, cool. One exercise that's proved very useful in working with teams is developing design principles. And this is from a recent project, but we built our design principles in 3 areas. Tell me why I should use this. Tell me what it does. Tell me how it works. Put all of this out in the open, because we can't work off of assumptions. Then next, show me how I can use it. Give me visuals, give me clear terms, give me a generalist introduction that is not insulting. And this can happen in terms of context. It can happen in terms of industry-specific things. And one developer I interviewed, he said, context is more important than content, as he scrolled straight to the sample code, because he wanted to see how it worked in the wild. And then next is this notion of building community over time. It's not enough to, I often come in and people say, well, we know we need to put in new documentation, but invest in this over time so that folks can become acquainted with it at the beginning, that they can see how to use it, and bring in, nurture those relationships with experts, so that we can have examples of how to use it, so that users can decide that the tool is for them. So what do we do next? I've given you an earful, and how do you apply this? I would advocate for you to, work on developing user research and design research in the developer tools process. Generate user flows and understand requirements, understand context through spending time with the folks who will use your product and in the environments that they're going to use your product. I'm a big fan of rapid iterative testing, and one of my favorite things to do is to work with teams to get them ramped up to test features as they come down the pipe instead of putting off usability testing till the very last minute, or, oh, we'll do that on the next release, that you never will. But if you integrate it into your process, it's a lot easier. I'm also a big fan of the participatory approach. So having folks come to you, having them, iterate on the features they want to see or the approach that they want to see, and use that for your docs. And I also, advocate again for organizational efforts to value and understand care work, whether it's in documentation or if it's in driving the shuttle bus or cleaning the office. How can we see this work as, as crucial as it needs to be? And lastly, let's work together. I started a learning program last year called UX Night School, and I also love to work with teams individually. So come find me later. Let's chat more about this, and thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much.